When we think of creativity, we usually don't think of seagulls. But if we are to methodize a new way of increasing our creativity, seagulls are actually quite a good place to begin. In fact, new research in science suggests that creativity is much more than a human process, and goes so far to suggest that creativity exists in biological and physical systems. Thus, understanding creativity in the broader sense is the first step to increasing one's own application of creativity. Too often, creativity discussions result in a binary opposition between the creative and the uncreative. It is far better for us to visualize creativity as a continuum, where more creativity is discussed as a matter of degree.
If we want to be more creative and accept that everything is creative to some degree, we must search for some criteria to analyze creativity on the continuum. We shall say that the criteria is influence, as all creative processes exert a force of influence of some kind on their broader social systems.
Now, if we immediately apply this idea to the artist, it may at first be confusing, because most artists create things that hang on walls as relatively uninfluential objects. But this judgment only applies to the object of art. Although the object of art is harmless, its influence is felt in the existing power network that surrounds it. The object may be used as propaganda by intellectuals, or as a symbol of a particular social issue which deprives one group and benefits another. This extends the message of the object.
If we consider influence as the measure of creativity, we can see its effects in the broader social network. That said, we can say that creativity requires an interaction outside of oneself. This interaction with the broader level of organization is thus termed creative feedback. As individuals, we employ creative feedback every day in every facet of our lives, just as all animals, and indeed all objects do. It is possible, though, to create one's own creative feedback, and this is the first step toward empowering individual creative ability.
For example, let's consider you are working on a project at work, writing a new policy of some kind. If you consider your writing as something that exists exclusively inside your head, discrete from what you are putting on the paper, you are not taking advantage of creative feedback. Fortunately, writing studies do not suggest that humans write in this way. Feedback occurs when a boundary is established between the writing in your head and the writing on the paper, and that boundary serves as a baseline for a creative feedback loop. Writing is thus more accurately described as a feedback process, where the idea in your head and the idea on the paper mutually transform each other. And this same feedback occurs when you cross the next boundary and share the document with your coworkers.
Creative feedback exists both on the individual and organizational levels, but in both cases, the individual idea of the worker is considerably less influential than the meta-idea or polar idea of the organization. A great example of this is in the feeding tactics of seagulls.
When a seagull comes upon an easy feeding opportunity, a creative feedback loop is established. The seagull wants the human to throw it a bit of food, but getting too close to the human is dangerous, and we can clearly see the boundary between the two creative forces. The seagull squawks. This catches the attention of the human, and he tosses the seagull a bit of bread. But the squawk has done something else. It has caught the ear of another seagull flying overhead. Seagull 1 has revealed his creative idea to Seagull 2, and now things begin to get really creative. Seagull 2 squawks and is rewarded with a bit of bread, but that reveals the opportunity to yet more seagulls, and furthermore forces Seagull 1 to squawk even louder. The feedback begins to cycle out of control, and more seagulls come to share in the creativity. Here we can see clearly how the group now feeds off the creativity that started with one individual seagull, Seagull 1. This is a microcosmic example of all creativity, for creative feedback is the very process in which individual influence is exerted within the broader social network.
Still, there is one more important thing we must know. Given we understand how creative feedback works, how then do we take control of the feedback and essentially become Seagull 1? The key lies in our ability to create a self-sustaining feedback loop that feeds off of its own energy. We call this state hypercreativity. To explain it, we shall turn to our last example, the windsurfer. The windsurfer is one of many systems that attains hypercreative feedback. For the windsurfer, this state is attained when its own velocity exceeds the velocity of the wind. How can that be? How can a moving object exceed the speed of its own generator? The answer is hypercreative feedback. Allow me to explain.
What occurs is a feedback loop is established between the wind and the windsurfer. The more the wind blows, the faster the windsurfer goes. But the process of acceleration of the windsurfer actually creates more wind. Just as when we stick our hand out of a car window, we feel wind, even if it's a perfectly calm day. If the average wind is 20 knots and the windsurfer accelerates to 20 knots, its own acceleration is creating an apparent wind of 20 knots, which the windsurfer itself recycles and uses to exceed the average wind speed and keep on accelerating. This high-velocity state of creative feedback is when the individual, existing within the organizational network, receives the power of the group as a generative force for more individual power. We could say, on one hand, that the most creative executives or artists are generating a force of influence that they ultimately use as recycled fuel. In this way, hypercreative executives always make more money than their organizations, and hypercreative artists always make more expensive objects. In order to become hypercreative people, we must always remember that all creative systems in business, art, and nature operate on the basic principle of creative feedback.
In short, keep your foot on the gas of your own creative journey. Now, I'd like to invite you to try the Global Point Strategies Creative Feedback audio program, which through a step-by-step series of techniques will teach you to see the creative feedback loops you're already working in, but more importantly, how to take control of your own individual creative feedback to someday become a hyper-creative individual. I'm Kurt Wiebers. Thank you for listening to me.